In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Welcome to The Missing Dots. Today on The Missing Dots, we open a chapter that many discuss in whispers, but few dare to examine with academic honesty. The Deobandi movement, born in the ashes of colonial collapse, shaped by fear, resistance, revival, and identity, stands as one of the most influential forces in the religious landscape of the subcontinent. But behind its seminaries, scholars, and global reach lie deeper questions. Why was this sect created? What anxieties and crises gave birth to it? Who engineered its foundations, and how did it spread so rapidly across India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and beyond? Did its teachings empower Muslims or restrict them? Did it nurture intellectual growth or close the doors of critical thinking? And in a modern world demanding science, inquiry, and openness, can this sect still carry the weight of contemporary challenges? Tonight, we step into history, theology, controversy, and the uncomfortable questions that many avoid not to attack, not to defend, but to understand.
Yeah, and that is the exact academic baseline we really need to establish right from the first minute here. For you tuning in, we need to be incredibly clear. Our goal here isn't to take a theological side. We aren't here to, endorse a specific interpretation of faith, and we're not here to condemn one either.
Exactly. We're looking at the source material.
Right. We're looking at this through an impartial historical and sociological lens, because we are analyzing a movement that today claims the adherence of roughly 15 to 20% of Sunni Muslims in Pakistan and India alone.
Which is just a staggering number.
It is. That translates to tens of millions of people. I mean, their daily lives, their legal frameworks, how they do business, their spiritual compasses, they're entirely shaped by this specific school of thought.
Yeah.
Yet, despite this massive global footprint, the movement is still heavily debated, deeply misunderstood by outsiders, and vigorously defended by its followers.
And to really do this justice, we aren't just giving a surface-level summary of the sources today. I'm looking at a massive stack of material on the table right now.
Oh yeah, it's extensive.
We have everything from colonial-era British intelligence archives to translated texts of the early legal rulings to modern sociological field studies from academics who actually spent years inside the madrasas.
And even contemporary manifestos from the scholars themselves.
Right. So whether you grew up in South Asia hearing these intense theological debates at the family dinner table, or, whether you are completely new to South Asian Islamic history and just incredibly curious about how the world works, this exploration is going to unpack the very roots of modern controversies.
Absolutely.
We're talking about everything from the geopolitical origins of the Taliban to the daily realities of madrasa education. But the thing is, you can't understand any of this if you just look at the theology.
No, you really can't.
Yeah, I was reading through the historical accounts in our sources, and it became incredibly obvious. You have to look at the trauma first. You have to look at the year 1857.
Yeah, 1857 is it's the earthquake that fundamentally altered the psychology of the Indian subcontinent.
The Sepoy Mutiny, right.
Right. Often referred to by the British as the Sepoy Mutiny or the Indian Rebellion. The British East India Company ruthlessly crushed this massive uprising, and the aftermath wasn't just a change in management. It was absolute devastation for the local populations.
Right, but the Muslim elite specifically, they bore a targeted brunt of that trauma.
Exactly. The Mughal Empire, which had been this massive symbol of Muslim political, cultural, and architectural dominance in India for centuries, was just formally and violently dissolved. The last emperor was exiled.
The British crown took direct, iron-fisted control.
They did.
And the sources paint such a vivid picture of this destruction. I mean, it wasn't just that they lost a war. The British actively dismantled the infrastructure of their entire civilization.
Right, they replaced Persian.
Yes. Persian, which was the language of the Muslim courts, the literature, the administration, they replaced it with English. So suddenly, centuries of administrative and legal expertise were just rendered obsolete overnight.
And it went even deeper into the religious infrastructure, too. The British confiscated waqf properties.
Let's explain that for a second.
Yeah, so for the listener who might not be familiar with that term, a waqf is a religious endowment. Historically, wealthy Muslims or the state would dedicate land or farms or businesses to an endowment.
Right.
And the revenue from that waqf would pay for the mosques, the schools, the salaries of the scholars, the hospitals.
It was a whole ecosystem.
Exactly, self-sustaining ecosystem of social welfare. And the British essentially seized these lands, just completely drying up the economic lifeblood of the religious scholarly class, the ulama.
So think about this. You have no political power, your language is suddenly sidelined, and your funding is completely gone.
Gone.
And on top of that, the sociologists in our sources point out there was this massive influx of Western education, secular values, and aggressive Christian missionary activity backed by the new colonial state.
Yeah.
For the scholars living through this, it must have literally felt like the end of the world.
It felt like an existential threat to Islam in South Asia. I mean, they didn't view 1857 merely as a military defeat.
How did they view it?
Many viewed it as a divine punishment for the moral decay of their own society. The intense, almost suffocating anxiety was that if they didn't do something drastic, Islam in India might just disappear within 2 or 3 generations.
Just absorbed entirely by the colonial machine.
Exactly.
And this intense anxiety, that's the catalyst. I found the story of their reactions so fascinating because they didn't pick up swords again.
No, the armed resistance had failed.
Right. Instead, a group of scholars, some of whom had actually fought in the 1857 rebellion, decided on a completely different strategy: intellectual and spiritual consolidation.
May 30th, 1866.
Yes, they established a small seminary, Darul Uloom Deoband.
In a really small town in Uttar Pradesh, roughly 90 miles from Delhi. I mean, they literally started under a pomegranate tree in the courtyard of the local Chata Masjid.
With, what, one teacher and one student?
Literally one teacher and one student.
It's such a humble origin story for something that becomes, a global powerhouse. You have these founding figures like Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanatawi.
He was really the principal architect of their educational and ideological vision.
Right. And Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, who provided the deep juristic legal authority, and guiding them both spiritually was Haji Imdadillah.
Yeah.
When I was reading about Nanatawi's vision for this school, an analogy hit me. Have you ever heard of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault?
The facility up in the Arctic Circle? Like the doomsday vault for agriculture.
Yes, that's the one. When global scientists realized that, climate change or nuclear war or some uncontrollable disease could wipe out the world's crop diversity, they built this impenetrable, freezing vault deep in a mountain in Norway.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. They locked away the purest, original versions of the world's seeds so that if an apocalypse happens, the core genetics survive. To me, Darul Uloom Deoband was built as a cultural and theological seed vault.
That is a remarkably accurate way to conceptualize it.
Nanatawi and Gangohi looked at the British Raj and saw a highly toxic radioactive environment. So they decided to take the absolute purest, most uncompromising orthodox version of their religious tradition and lock it away inside this highly disciplined Madrasas system.
To survive the colonial winter.
Exactly.
And their stated motives were explicitly about preservation and purification. They wanted to create a self-sustaining counterculture that was completely resistant to British cultural assimilation.
They didn't want to engage with the British at all.
Not at all. They wanted to build a wall against them.
But I found myself pushing back on this strategy a bit while reading the sources. Because, well, if you lock your seeds in a freezing vault, yes, they survive the winter, but doesn't locking them away mean they stop interacting with the ecosystem?
Right.
Like they stop adapting to the changing weather outside?
Right.
Does the pure survival of the tradition come at the cost of its evolution?
That right there is the defining tension of the entire Deobandi movement.
Right.
And it's a debate we're going to see playing out in their history all the way up to the present day.
How do they respond to that?
Well, the founders would counter that argument by saying the seeds of divine revelation, the Quran, and the authentic practices of the prophet, they don't need to adapt to human weather. Humans and human society are what need to adapt to the seeds. The truth is fixed. It is the modern world that is broken.
Honestly, I never thought about it that way. It's actually pretty simple from their perspective.
It is.
But, to build this fortress, they had a massive, immediate logistical problem. You mentioned earlier that the British confiscated the WAF endowments.
Right, the funding was gone.
Yeah, the Mughal emperors were no longer there to write a blank check for a new seminary. So how do you build a massive educational counterculture with absolutely zero state funding?
They engineered a completely new financial model for Islamic education in South Asia. They relied almost entirely on a system called chanda.
Which just means public donations, right?
Right, but the sources point out this wasn't just asking rich merchants for big checks. It was a hyper-grassroots approach.
Yeah.
They went to the everyday people, the tailors, the farmers, the street vendors, the widows, and asked for pennies, a handful of rice, whatever small change they could spare.
I want to pause on this because the sociological impact of this is huge. By relying on the pennies of the working class instead of the gold of a king, they completely democratized religious authority.
They did.
Historically, scholars were tied to the royal courts. If you were a scholar, your livelihood depended on not upsetting the local nobility. But by switching to the Chanda system, Darul Uloom Deoband shifted the power base directly to the common people.
And critically, it insulated them from the state. The British government couldn't threaten to cut their funding if the madrasa taught something anti-colonial, because the British weren't paying the bills anyway.
The local community was.
Exactly. This financial independence meant the scholars were deeply embedded in the daily lives, the struggles, and the aspirations of the average Muslim on the street. It forged this unbreakable bond between the seminary and the masses.
Okay, so the seed vault is built, and it's funded by the people. Let's actually look inside the vault. If you stop someone on the street in Karachi, or, say, Bradford in the UK, who identifies as Deobandi, what exactly is their theological DNA?
Well, the sources are very careful to point out that they are not a new sect.
Right.
Far from it. They are a strict, revivalist tradition firmly planted within the massive umbrella of Sunni Islam. To break down the technical terms the sources use, theologically, regarding their creed and how they understand the nature of God, they follow the maturity school.
Let's explain what that actually means in practice, because terms like maturity can sound incredibly dense to someone just casually listening.
Sure. Simply put, the maturity creed is one of the classical schools of Sunni theology. It emphasizes a balance between human reason and divine revelation.
Okay.
But ultimately, it asserts that God's actions are full of divine wisdom, even if human beings cannot rationally comprehend that wisdom. It's a very established, orthodox position.
And what about their daily practice?
Right, jurisprudentially meaning how they derive the practical rules of daily life, from how to pray to how to conduct a business contract. They strictly follow the Hanafi school of law.
And the Hanafi school, founded by Imam Abu Hanifa in the 8th century, is known for being incredibly detailed, structured, and historically the most widely practiced legal school in the Muslim world, especially in South Asia and the old Ottoman lands.
Yes. So their foundation is deeply, uncompromisingly traditional. But what makes a Deobandi distinct from, say, another traditional Hanafi scholar in Turkey or Syria?
Yeah, what is the difference?
It's the specific flavor and rigor of that tradition. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating paradoxes highlighted in the sociological research: their complex relationship with Sufism.
Honestly, when I hit this section in the reading, I was genuinely surprised.
Most people are.
Because when people today think of strict, orthodox, almost stoic religious movements, they usually assume those movements despise Sufism. Sufism is often associated in the popular mind with, like, mysticism, poetry, ecstatic dancing, and a generally more relaxed, fluid approach to religion.
Right.
But the historical texts show that the founders of Deoband were deeply initiated into Sufi orders, specifically the Chishti and Naqshbandi path.
They were intimately connected to it. I mean, Haji Imdadullah, the spiritual mentor who guided Nenatawi and Gangohi, was a major Sufi sheikh. But we have to clarify what they mean by Sufism here. The Deobandists champion what academics often call sober or Sharia-compliant Sufism.
Sober Sufism, what does that actually look like?
They believe the sole authentic purpose of Sufism or tasawwuf is tazkiyah. That means the rigorous purification of the inner soul, the constant battle against one's own ego, the elimination of arrogance and greed, and cultivating a deep internalized consciousness of God.
So it's the inner work.
Purely the inner work. Because they draw a massive, fiercely enforced line when it comes to the cultural practices that attach themselves to Sufism over the centuries. They are vehemently anti-bid'ah.
Which translates to religious innovation.
Right. This is where their strictness really manifests. They look at the popular everyday Sufi practices of 19th century India. They saw people prostrating at the graves of dead saints.
Asking those buried saints for wealth or children.
Exactly. They saw massive carnival-like festivals held at shrines known as urs. They saw the practice of sama, which involves ecstatic singing, rhythmic music, and dancing to achieve a state of spiritual trance.
And the Deobandi scholars looked at all of that and basically said, this isn't Islam.
They viewed it as severe deviation. They saw asking a dead saint for help as creeping polytheism or shirk. They saw the music and the festivals as unauthorized innovations that the Prophet Muhammad and his early companions never practiced.
The logic being, if the religion was already perfect, adding to it is an insult.
Their exact logic is, if the Prophet's religion was perfect and complete, Adding new, elaborate rituals implies that he left something out.
So they essentially kept the harsh spiritual discipline of Sufism,
Hmm.
the fasting, the intense extra prayers, the silent remembrance of God, but they aggressively stripped away all the cultural pageantry, the music, and the shrine veneration.
Yeah?
They wanted the medicine without any of the sugarcoating.
Precisely. They wanted a highly intellectual, legally rigorous, inwardly disciplined faith. And to mass-produce scholars with this specific mindset, they needed a very specific educational engine.
Which brings us to the famous Darzi Nizami curriculum. I want to spend some time on this because if you want to understand how a Deobandi scholar thinks, you really have to look at what they study for 8 to 10 years.
The Darza-Nizami is a standardized syllabus that actually predates the Deoband movement by over a century. But the Deobandists adopted it, formalized it, and made it their global standard.
Right.
The defining characteristic of how they apply this curriculum is a massive prioritization of the transmitted sciences, the Naqli sciences.
Which are the Quran, the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, and classical jurisprudence.
Yes.
Now, the sources mention that they do study rational sciences, specifically a lot of medieval Aristotelian logic or mantic, but I noticed a critical caveat. They don't study philosophy to encourage open-ended, freewheeling speculation about the universe, do they?
Not at all. They view open-ended philosophical speculation as a dangerous pathway to doubt. They study medieval logic purely as a functional tool.
Like a mental gym.
Exactly. It's a mechanism to sharpen the mind so the scholar can rigorously defend orthodox theology against critics, and so they can master the incredibly complex, intricate rules of legal debate within the Hanafi school. And the absolute pinnacle of this grueling educational system is the final year, known as the Dora Hadis.
Right, the capstone year. The descriptions of this in the source texts are intense. The students sit on the floor for hours every single day, reading through the entirety of the 6 canonical collections of hadith from cover to cover.
It's an endurance test of memorization and linguistic comprehension.
But this reliance on centuries-old texts brings up a major critique found in the modern sociological sources. The Deobandi movement places a foundational emphasis on something called taqlid.
Yes, taqlid is central to their worldview. It means the strict, binding adherence to the established legal rulings of a specific school of law, in their case, the Hanafi school.
And here's where I, representing you, the modern listener, have to push back. If taqlid means you must follow the precedents set by scholars from the 8th and 9th centuries, and you are forbidden from opening the Quran yourself to derive a new meaning that fits the year 2026. Doesn't that essentially kill free thinking?
That's a huge question.
Doesn't it enforce intellectual stagnation by design?
That is a very common, very sharp critique, heavily voiced by Islamic modernists and secular academics alike. But the classical Deobandi scholars mount a very robust logical defense of taqlid.
Okay, walk me through their logic.
They argue that taqlid is not blind, mindless obedience, which is how critics frame it. They argue it is the entirely rational reliance on established, highly qualified authority. The classic analogy they use is a medical one.
A medical analogy?
Yeah, if you wake up with severe chest pain, you don't go to a library, check out a biology textbook, read about the heart, and then try to perform open-heart surgery on yourself.
Yeah, right, you die.
You go to a trained surgeon, you submit to their diagnosis, and you trust their expertise. They argue that the classical imams, like Abu Hanifa, were the master surgeons of Islamic law. They possessed a mastery of the Arabic language, the historical context, and the immense volume of hadith that simply does not exist today.
So they view the modern layman trying to interpret the Quran directly as arrogant, not enlightened.
Exactly. They believe a layman attempting to derive complex legal rulings directly from the raw text of the scripture without decades of training is a recipe for catastrophic error. It would lead to the fracturing of the religious community.
But do they ever allow for new interpretations? What if a totally new issue arises, like cryptocurrency or gene editing? The 8th century scholars didn't write about Bitcoin.
They do allow for ijtihad, which is independent legal reasoning, but the barrier to entry is astronomically high. It is reserved for only a tiny fraction of elite, highly qualified scholars.
So it's not a free-for-all.
No, and even then, that reasoning is almost always conducted strictly within the methodological boundaries of the Hanafi framework. In a chaotic world, they view taqlid as an anchor that provides crucial consistency.
The anchor in the storm. I see where you're going. But this creates a massive puzzle for me. You have this highly disciplined, rigid, text-focused, anti-innovation movement that demands intense submission to classical authority, right? And it was born in a tiny rural town in India.
Yeah.
How does a movement that strict go global? I'm looking at the demographics and the sources, and the numbers are staggering. In Pakistan today, Deobandi-affiliated groups run an estimated 65% of all religious seminaries.
It's massive.
In Bangladesh, they control the huge Qawmi Madrasa network, educating millions of children.
Yeah.
They have a dominant, defining presence in Afghanistan. And it's not just in South Asia. If you look at the diaspora, especially in the United Kingdom, Deobandi networks run over 40% of the mosques and produce the vast majority of locally trained imams.
Right.
You don't achieve that kind of staggering market penetration just by sitting in a library reading medieval logic. What is the missing link between the classroom and the street?
The missing link and the absolute engine of their global expansion is a movement called the Tablighi Jamaat.
The Tablighi Jamaat, the sources dedicate entire chapters to them. How did this start?
It was founded in the 1920s by a prominent Deobandi scholar named Maulana Muhammad Ilyas Kandlali. He was operating in the Mewat region near Delhi, and he looked around at the rural Muslim populations. These were people who identified as Muslim by name, but who had deeply syncretic practices, sometimes barely knowing how to perform the basic prayers. He realized that the traditional Deobandi strategy of sitting in a seminary and waiting for the masses to come to them for education simply wasn't working.
The people weren't coming to the vault, so he had to take the seeds to the people.
Precisely. He initiated a grassroots missionary offshoot. But Muhammad Ilyas was brilliant in his methodology. He knew that you couldn't preach complex medieval logic or intricate Hanafi fiqh to an illiterate farmer. It just wouldn't work.
Right.
So he made the message incredibly simple, universally accessible, and most importantly, completely apolitical.
Yeah.
He stripped away all the divisive theological debates.
The sources outline the Tablighi Jamaat's methodology, and it's based on just 6 basic principles. It's almost like a spiritual franchise manual. The principles are declaring the basic article of faith, establishing the 5 daily prayers, acquiring basic religious knowledge and remembering God, respecting all other Muslims, ensuring complete sincerity of intention, and finally, the physical act of sparing time to travel and preach.
That physical travel, often called khuruj, is the defining characteristic.
Yeah.
It is entirely decentralized and egalitarian.
Meaning anyone can do it.
Right. Groups of men from all walks of life. You might have a wealthy doctor walking alongside a poor taxi driver. They pack a small bag, leave their homes and families for periods of 3 days, 40 days, or even 4 months.
Wow.
They travel at their own expense, sleep on the floors of local mosques, and simply walk from door to door in different neighborhoods, gently asking the men to come to the mosque for prayer.
It's door-to-door salesmanship, but for spiritual awakening. And because it avoids politics entirely, they explicitly forbid discussing government policies or sectarian conflicts during their missions, they manage to operate under the radar of highly suspicious governments worldwide.
Yeah, that was key.
The research notes they survived the harsh crackdowns in Soviet Central Asia, and they continue to operate freely in post-9/11 Europe and North America, where other Islamic groups faced intense scrutiny.
Their apolitical nature is their ultimate shield, and the scale today is breathtaking. Their annual gatherings, known as ijtimas, in places like Bangladesh and Pakistan, regularly attract millions of attendees.
Millions, subhanAllah.
They're often cited as the second largest peaceful gatherings of Muslims in the world, behind only the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca.
And the synergy between this massive Dawah movement and the madrasas is incredible. The Tablighi Jamaat goes out, knocks on doors, and wakes people up spiritually. When those newly practicing individuals want a deeper, formal religious education for their children, where do they send them?
To the local Deobandi Madrasa.
Exactly. They send them to the local Deobandi Madrasa. It's a perfect, self-sustaining closed loop. Which brings me to another analogy I scribbled down while reading the sociology papers. When you look at how the Deobandi Madrasa system spread globally, it operates exactly like an open-source franchise model.
Walk me through the mechanics of that analogy.
Well, think about a corporate franchise like McDonald's. It's highly centralized. Every decision goes through corporate headquarters. The Catholic Church operates similarly, with the Pope and a strict hierarchy.
Right.
But Darul Uloom Deoband doesn't have a pope. There is no central CEO commanding every madrasa globally. Instead, the founders created an open-source curriculum, the Darzi Nizami. anyone in any village in Pakistan or any neighborhood in Chicago can gather some local chanda, rent a storefront, or build a small mosque, adopt the Darzi Nizami curriculum, and hire a teacher trained in the methodology.
Yeah, plug and play.
Instantly, you are plugged into this massive, trusted global network. You instantly have the brand credibility of being Deobandi without needing a stamped certificate from corporate headquarters in India.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize their institutional resilience. The radical decentralization is their greatest strength. It makes the movement practically immortal.
Because there's no single target.
Right. You cannot destroy the Deobandi movement by assassinating one leader or bombing one headquarters, because the authority is distributed across thousands of independent nodes that all share the exact same theological DNA.
But this brings up a deeply psychological question. The sources make it clear that the Deobandi scholars and the Tablighi preachers didn't offer people an easier life. They didn't come to a village and say, hey, join us, we'll give you a modernized, relaxed version of Islam.
In fact, they were much stricter.
Exactly. They banned the local festivals, they banned the music at cultural weddings, they demanded rigorous daily discipline. Why would a poor farmer or a struggling factory worker in a colonial city opt into a stricter, harder, more demanding version of religion?
Because human psychology, especially in times of immense trauma and social upheaval, which is exactly what colonialism, rapid urbanization, and modernity bring, doesn't always seek the path of least resistance.
Interesting.
When everything around you is chaotic, changing, and confusing, people crave profound clarity. They want a black and white moral compass.
They want the anchor in the storm.
Yes. The Deobandi movement offered immense discipline. It offered a sense of dignity, a pure, authentic identity that was completely untainted by the British colonizers or the encroaching Western culture. And on a purely practical level, we cannot ignore the socioeconomic factor.
The free education.
Right. They offered free education. For a poor family with absolutely no access to expensive colonial schools, the local Deobandi Madrasa offered their child literacy, a highly structured life, 3 meals a day, elevated status in the community as a scholar, and the ultimate promise of salvation in the afterlife.
Alhamdulillah, when you really look at the sheer logistical scale of this grassroots mobilization achieved without state funding, without a standing army, just relying on public donations and door-to-door preaching it, is a phenomenal achievement in human organization.
It is a masterclass in grassroots sociological mobilization.
And this is a massive but, one that we have to confront head-on based on the historical reality. Decentralization has a dark side.
It certainly does.
The open-source franchise model is brilliant for growth, but if you don't control the central brand, you can't always control what your franchisees do with the ideology. Let's move into the shadow of politics, geopolitics, militancy, and the emergence of the Taliban.
This is undoubtedly the most scrutinized, debated, and globally consequential aspect of the movement's history over the last 40 years. And again, to you listening, we are maintaining our strict academic neutrality here.
Absolutely.
We are going to look at the geopolitical facts, the timeline of how this fracture happened, and critically, how mainstream Deobandi scholars defend their tradition against these associations today.
Let's trace the political evolution because it is wild. We established that early on, the founders of Deoband were fiercely anti-colonial, but they largely focused on education. However, some of their top scholars were deeply covertly involved in militant politics aimed at overthrowing the British Empire.
Right.
The sources detail a fascinating plot known as the Silk Letter Movement.
Yes, the Tariq-e-Rishmi Rumal. This took place during the height of World War I. One of the leading figures of the Deobandi movement at the time, Maulana Mahmud Hassan, famously known by the title Sheikh al-Hind, orchestrated a massive, covert, revolutionary conspiracy.
What was the plan?
He recognized that the British were distracted by the global war. His goal was to secure military support and weapons from the Ottoman Empire and Imperial Germany, smuggle them into the tribal areas of Afghanistan, and trigger a massive armed uprising against the British in India.
And the name Silk Letter isn't a metaphor, right?
No, not at all. The secret communications, the military plans, and the treaties were literally written in ink on pieces of yellow silk cloth and smuggled by couriers across borders.
It was an incredible piece of espionage, but unfortunately for Mahmud Hassan, British intelligence intercepted the Silk Letters. The plot was blown wide open. Mahmud Hassan was arrested in Mecca by Arab allies of the British and ultimately exiled to a harsh British prison in Malta for several years.
But his imprisonment cemented the Deobandi legacy as fearless anti-imperial resistors.
Right. Yet, what fascinated me in the historical archives is their political stance regarding the independence of India. The main Deobandi political organ, an organization called the Jamiat Ulema-e Hind, historically supported a concept called composite nationalism.
This is a crucial historical nuance that often shocks people today. During the 1920s and 30s, when the Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was arguing for the partition of India and the creation of a separate Muslim state, Pakistan, the leading Deobandi scholars aggressively opposed it.
Wait, the strict Orthodox religious scholars opposed the creation of an Islamic state. Why?
Because of how they define nationhood. They argued that the Ummah, the global community of Muslims, is a spiritual bond that transcends borders. But nationhood, the physical state, is based on shared land and geography.
Oh, I see.
They argued fiercely that Hindus and Muslims could and should form a single, united, secular nation to expel the British. They believed Muslims could live perfectly freely in a pluralistic Hindu-majority India, provided their religious personal laws, their madrasas, and their mosques were constitutionally protected.
That is incredible context. So you have the foundational scholars of this movement actively advocating for Hindu-Muslim political unity against the British Empire. But for a listener turning on the news in 2026, when they hear the word Deobandi, they don't think of composite nationalism.
No, they don't.
They think of the Taliban. They think of armed militancy, RPGs, and strict control in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. How in the world do we get from anti-British scholars advocating for a united India to armed militant factions in Afghanistan and Pakistan?
The fracture happens primarily in the late 1970s and 1980s, and the catalyst isn't theology, it's Cold War geopolitics.
Okay.
When India was partitioned in 1947, a massive segment of Deobandi scholars migrated to the newly formed state of Pakistan. In Pakistan, the movement became highly politicized. They formed political parties like the Jamiat Ulema-Islam to lobby the state to implement Sharia law. But the true turning point, the moment the timeline splits, is 1979.
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Exactly. When the atheist communist Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the local Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, suddenly became the front line of the global Cold War.
Right.
The United States, operating through the CIA and Saudi Arabia, poured billions of dollars in covert funding and weapons into Pakistan to fund this resistance. The Pakistani military state, under the dictatorship of General Zia-ul-Haq, became the conduit for this money.
And what did Zia-ul-Haq do with it?
He strategically used those billions to heavily fund, expand, and militarize a vast network of Deobandi madrasas located along the porous Afghan border.
Because these specific madrasas were already full of Afghan refugees and rural Pashtun youth who naturally shared the broad Deobandi ideology.
Precisely. The state essentially weaponized the educational network. These seminaries, which had historically focused on classical texts and spiritual discipline, were transformed overnight into recruitment centers and ideological training grounds for the anti-Soviet jihad.
Wow.
The traditional Deobandi curriculum, which was always deeply conservative, was suddenly married to a heavily funded, heavily armed, state-sponsored militant infrastructure.
And the word Taliban itself
Literally translates from Arabic and Pashto simply as students. Specifically, the students of these militarized Deobandi madrasas. After the Soviets were bled dry and withdrew, Afghanistan descended into a horrific, lawless civil war in the early 1990s.
Right.
Out of that chaos, these young militarized students emerged under the leadership of Mullah Omar. They utilized the strictness of their ideology, backed by weapons, to brutally impose order and end the civil war.
So the Afghan Taliban is undeniably ideologically rooted in the Deobandi tradition. But the sociological reports show the violence didn't stay contained in Afghanistan. The franchise splintered further.
It did.
This militarization leaked back into the host country, Pakistan, giving rise to groups like the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, who actively fight the Pakistani state. And it birthed horrific sectarian militant groups like Sipa-i-Sahaba Pakistan and Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, whose explicit goal is the violent eradication of Shia Muslims.
That is a tragic, complex historical reality. The geopolitical weaponization of the border madrasa network created a violent, radicalized strain that operates completely outside the control and often outside the theology of the traditional scholarly hierarchy sitting in the original seminaries.
So how do modern mainstream Deobandi scholars, the ones teaching theology in India or running mosques in London, defend this? Because they are incredibly intelligent men. They are acutely aware that their global brand has been internationally synonymous with terrorism for decades.
They are acutely aware, and they defend their intellectual tradition vigorously. Mainstream Deobandi scholars argue consistently that their foundational texts and their classical interpretation of Hanafi law strictly and unequivocally prohibit violence against civilians, non-combatants, and the state. They argue that the militant groups have grossly misinterpreted, weaponized, and selectively applied classical rulings on jihad without fulfilling the strict legal preconditions required to declare it.
The sources mention that they haven't just stayed silent on this, they've mobilized massive scholarly refutations.
They have. In 2008, the Mother Seminary itself, Darul Uloom Deoband in India, organized a massive, highly publicized conference. They issued a categorical, binding fatwa declaring all forms of terrorism and the killing of innocent civilians as completely un-Islamic and forbidden.
Basically excommunicating the concept of terrorism from their tradition.
Yes. Later, in 2016, we saw an even larger mobilization in Bangladesh, the Fatwa of Peace for Humanity. It was signed by over 100,000 scholars, the vast majority of them from the Deobandi Kwame network, explicitly condemning terrorism and militancy in the strongest possible terms.
And regarding the Taliban specifically, how do they distance themselves from the students of their own curriculum?
Prominent scholars argue that the Taliban essentially debased and mutated the Deobandi tradition. They point out that what the Taliban practices in Afghanistan is not pure classical Deobandism. It is a highly volatile blend of rigid Deobandi theology, mixed heavily with Pashtunwali.
Pashtunwali being the ancient, strict, patriarchal tribal code of the ethnic Pashtuns.
Yes, they argue that tribal culture often overrides the actual Islamic jurisprudence. Furthermore, mainstream scholars point out that a true Deobandi scholar relies on deep legal reasoning, historical nuance, and centuries of debate.
Right, the mantique.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In contrast, they view the militant approach as aggressively anti-intellectual, deeply reductionist, and entirely focused on utilizing brute force, rather than engaging in spiritual persuasion or academic rigor.
Basically, the scholars are saying, we are a movement of books, teachers, and preachers, not warlords. But this friction, this intense, grinding clash between an ancient Orthodox worldview and the realities of the modern era extends far beyond just geopolitics and armed militancy. It bleeds directly into how the movement interacts with the natural sciences, with the global economy, and intimately with women and society.
Yes, this is where the tension between the seed vault analogy and the changing weather outside becomes most palpable and, frankly, the most controversial.
I want to start with the scientific void because the sociological papers explicitly highlight a glaring critique levied by both Islamic modernists and secular academics. Out of the tens of millions of followers, the thousands of massive institutional madrasas, and over 150 years of uninterrupted educational history, there are 0 Deobandi Nobel laureates in the natural sciences. There is a deep, historically documented rejection of Darwinian evolution. And for over a century, their core curriculum almost entirely ignored biology, physics, chemistry, and empirical research. If you are a listener today who believes that scientific progress is the hallmark of a successful civilization, this sounds like a catastrophic educational failure. Why does this void exist?
To understand this, we have to step out of the modern secular framework and look directly through their epistemological lens. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know and what knowledge is actually valuable.
Right.
To the traditional Deobandi scholar, what is the ultimate purpose of acquiring knowledge? The metric of human success is not material invention. It is not about conquering nature, building a better microchip, or winning a Nobel Prize. The absolute ultimate metric of human success is the preservation of the soul from sin and securing a favorable outcome in the akhirah, the eternal hereafter.
So studying quantum physics won't save your soul on the day of judgment.
Exactly. They view the empirical natural sciences as functional worldly knowledge, ilm dunya. It is useful certainly for building bridges, treating illnesses, or running an economy, but it is entirely secondary.
And potentially dangerous?
Critically dangerous if an over-reliance on scientific materialism leads a student to doubt the unseen realities of faith. They believe the Darzi Nazami provides the essential eternal truths of revelation. Why dilute a curriculum designed specifically to produce guardians of the faith with scientific subjects whose theories change every single generation?
So when confronted with a direct conflict, like the theory of human evolution versus the scriptural account of the creation of Adam, how do they handle it?
They don't compromise. Many modern religious thinkers will try to allegorize the story of Adam, arguing it's a metaphor that can fit neatly within Darwinian biology. The Deobandi scholars generally reject that completely.
You hold the line.
They hold the line on the literal textual narrative of Revelation. For them, the absolute truth of the divine text always overrides the shifting temporary paradigms of human science.
But the sources point out one massive, glaring exception where Deobandi scholarship has aggressively and incredibly successfully engaged with the modern secular world. They might ignore biology, but they absolutely dominate modern commercial banking.
Yes, the realm of global Islamic finance. This is where their deep historical obsession with fiqh jurisprudence meets modern capitalism.
Explain the mechanism of this because it's fascinating to me. How did they engage with a global banking system built entirely on interest, which is strictly forbidden in Islam?
It comes down to practical necessity. For a Muslim to live in the modern globalized world, they have to interact with finance. They need mortgages, they need business loans, they need international trade letters of credit. But the Quran strictly prohibits riba, which is generally understood as any form of usury or interest on a loan.
So how do they get around it?
You have contemporary Deobandi intellectual titans, most notably Mufti Taqi Usmani from Pakistan, who is arguably one of the most powerful and influential figures in the global Islamic finance industry today. He, and scholars operating in his tradition, took the classical medieval rulings on trade and profit-sharing concepts like mudaraba and engineered incredibly complex legal structures to allow Muslims to participate in modern banking without violating Sharia law.
Wait, how do you buy a house without a bank charging you interest on a loan? What is the actual mechanism?
Let's use a mortgage as an example.
Yeah.
Instead of the bank lending you $300,000 at a 5% interest rate, which is forbidden, the bank actually purchases the house jointly with you as a business partner.
Okay.
The bank owns, say, 90% of the equity and you own 10%. You then pay the bank rent for living in their portion of the house, and simultaneously, you slowly buy their equity shares month by month until you own 100% of the property.
Oh.
Economically, the cash flow might look similar to a traditional mortgage, but legally and contractually, no money was ever lent and no interest was ever charged. It is an equity shift based on trade.
That is brilliant legal engineering. So when a practical legal problem arises, like how do I run a business without interest, they deploy their incredible mastery of classical law to invent a functional, modern solution. But when the problem is philosophical or purely scientific, they disengage and build a wall.
That is a very accurate summary. They are brilliant legal pragmatists, but they remain uncompromising theological purists.
Which brings us to the most controversial aspect of their purism, and the section of the research that will undoubtedly challenge many listeners the most, their rulings regarding women and society. The sources are absolutely packed with critiques regarding their highly conservative social fatwas. We are talking about explicit, formalized rulings restricting women from working in mixed-gender corporate or public environments. Rulings enforcing strict gender segregation in education and society. Rulings mandating the niqab, the veil covering the face, not just the hair. And rulings requiring a mahram, a male guardian, or relative to accompany a woman if she travels long distances.
And secular critics, human rights organizations, and Islamic feminists point out that these rulings drastically limit women's participation in public life, higher education, and the modern economic workforce.
Honestly, I have to step into the shoes of the listener here. If you are listening to this on your commute in London, New York, or even modern Karachi in 2026, navigating a hyper-connected, globalized economy where women are CEOs, surgeons, astronauts, and heads of state, these rulings sound totally incompatible with modern life.
Right.
To the modern ear, it simply sounds suffocating and oppressive. How on earth does a highly educated Deobandi scholar, sitting in a fatwa council, intellectually defend these rulings today?
The defense is entirely rooted in their overarching worldview regarding moral hazard and the preservation of society. In Islamic jurisprudence, they operate heavily under a legal principle known as Sad al-Darai.
Saad al-Darai. What does that translate to?
It roughly translates to blocking the means to evil, or proactively closing the doors to temptation. The logic is that if an action is lawful in itself, but it has a high probability of leading to a forbidden outcome, that original action must also be blocked.
Okay, unpack that in the context of gender mixing.
The Deobandi scholar looks at Western liberal society. They look at the unconstrained mixing of genders in workplaces and universities. They look at hypersexualized media, the normalization of casual relationships, and the intense focus on individual freedom over familial duty.
And what do they see?
They don't see a utopia of freedom. They
Yeah.
see a civilization in catastrophic moral collapse. They point to skyrocketing divorce rates, the total breakdown of the traditional nuclear family, the epidemic of single parenthood, and what they view as the gross commodification of women's bodies in advertising and culture.
So they view their strict restrictions not as a cage, but as a preventative shield.
Precisely. They argue that rulings like the niqab, strict segregation, and the mahram travel requirement are emphatically not designed to oppress women. In their framework, these rules are designed to protect the inherent dignity of women, shield men from their own base temptations, and ultimately preserve the absolute sanctity of the family unit, which they view as the foundational bedrock of any healthy society.
Because the family is everything.
Right. If allowing unchecked mixing has even a fractional chance of leading to infidelity and the destruction of a family, Sad al-Darai dictates you block the mixing. Furthermore, they argue that the primary, most sacred, and most socially vital role for a woman is within the domestic sphere, raising and morally educating the next generation of believers.
Right. The outer environment dictates the inner soul. The sources mention their belief that a society that has lost its internal moral compass requires physical segregation as an external defense mechanism. But this intensely insular worldview puts them in a constant grinding state of friction. And not just with the secular West. It puts them in direct conflict with almost every other sect within the Islamic world. In the research, there's this massive framework detailing how the Deobandis are attacked in a theological crossfire from literally every side of the spectrum.
It really is a multi-front theological war. Because they claim the absolute mantle of strict, uncompromising orthodoxy, they are forced to constantly defend their boundaries against everyone they perceive as deviating from that specific interpretation.
Let's start with the rivals within South Asian Sunni Islam. We mentioned the Barelvis briefly earlier. The Barelvi movement is another massive, incredibly populist Sunni group in the subcontinent, founded by Imam Ahmad Raza Khan.
Yes.
The rivalry between Deobandis and Barelvis is historically intense, deeply bitter, and occasionally erupts into physical violence over mosque control. What is the core theological engine of this conflict?
At its absolute core, it boils down to the veneration and the exact metaphysical nature of the Prophet Muhammad. The Barelvis accuse the Deobandis of being highly disrespectful. They view the Deobandi approach as a dry, overly legalistic, almost robotic religion that strips away the immense love, majesty, and mystical reverence owed to the Prophet.
And what are the specific flashpoints where this plays out in public?
The most visible flashpoint is the practice of the Mawlid, the celebration of the Prophet's birthday. The Barelvi movement celebrates the Mawlid with massive, joyous public processions, poetry, lights, and feasting.
And the Deobandis?
The Deobandis strictly ban the celebration as a bid'ah, a religious innovation, arguing that the Prophet himself and the early generations of Muslims never celebrated it. But the divide goes much deeper into theology, specifically regarding the concepts of Hazir o Nazir and Ilmul Gaib.
Explain those two concepts because they are central to the debate.
Hazir o Nazir translates to omnipresent and seeing. The Barelvi theology generally holds that the spirit of the Prophet Muhammad is spiritually omnipresent. He can witness the actions of his community across the world. Coupled with this is Ilmul Gaib, meaning knowledge of the unseen. Barelvis believe God granted the Prophet exhaustive knowledge of the unseen, including knowledge of the future.
And the Deobandis reject this completely.
Fiercely and absolutely. The Deobandis argue that attributing omnipresence or exhaustive, unlimited knowledge of the unseen to anyone other than Allah is dangerously crossing the line into shirk associating partners with God.
The Deobandi defense is about Tawhid, right?
Yes. They argue that true, authentic love for the Prophet doesn't mean elevating him to quasi-divine status. True love means meticulously following his exact sunnah, his legal and personal example, down to how he ate and slept. They see themselves as the ultimate protectors of Tawhid, absolute, uncompromising monotheism.
Okay, so that's the massive attack from the more mystical, popular side of the spectrum. But then you look at the other flank, and you have the Salafis, or the Ali Hadith movement, attacking the Deobandis for completely different reasons.
Exactly. The Salafists criticize the Deobandis from the perspective of hyperliteralism. They attack the Deobandis for their strict adherence to taqlid, blindly following the 8th century Hanafi school.
Because Salafis don't follow a specific madhab.
Right. The Salafists argue that Muslims should bypass the classical legal schools and derive laws directly from the literal text of the Quran and Hadith. Furthermore, the Salafists heavily criticize the Deobandi affiliation with Sufi orders. Even though the Deobandis practice sober Sufism, the Salafists argue that the entire framework of Sufi masters and Tazkiyah rituals is a post-prophetic deviation.
So the Deobandis are basically fighting a two-front war. To the Barelvis on their left, they say you have too much innovation and pageantry. To the Salafis on their right, they say you have too little respect for the classical legal tradition.
They view themselves as the balanced middle path, the true al-sunnah wal-jama, holding the strict orthodox line between popular superstition and modern anti-traditional literalism.
But the toughest, most uncomfortable, and most taboo questions in the sociological sources don't come from other Islamic sects. They come from atheists, secularists, and the growing community of ex-Muslims.
Yeah, that's a very different type of critique.
The research addresses a difficult reality. Some young people, especially those raised in the diaspora in the West or in highly connected urban centers, are leaving the faith entirely. And the profound critique from these groups is that the sheer unyielding rigidity of the Deobandi system creates a psychologically claustrophobic environment.
The psychological pressure of an all-or-nothing system. Yes, critics argue that when religion is presented not just as core beliefs, but as an inflexible list of thousands of hyper-specific fatwas regulating everything from how you sleep, which foot you under the bathroom with, to how you conduct complex business, it creates a fragile structure.
Like a house of cards.
Exactly. If a young person develops an intellectual doubt about one piece of the structure, the whole thing can shatter for them.
And the sources bring up the incredibly heavy existential issue of apostasy laws. The traditional Deobandi fiqh maintains the classical legal position that public apostasy, leaving Islam in an Islamic state, is a capital offense. For a modern secular critic, this is the ultimate undeniable proof of intolerance. How do the scholars address this existential critique? If a brilliant student in their madrasa comes to them with deep, philosophical, agonizing doubts about the existence of God or the morality of certain historical texts, how do they handle it?
This reveals a profound, unbridgeable epistemological divide between traditionalism and modernity. In the modern Western secular framework, doubt is considered a high virtue. It is the core engine of scientific progress and intellectual discovery. You're supposed to question everything. But in the traditional Deobandi framework, doubt regarding the revealed truth of the Quran or the prophethood is not an intellectual tool. It is a severe spiritual disease. It is a deficiency in the heart, often caused by a lack of sincerity, the whispers of the devil, or the toxic influence of secular materialism.
So you don't cure a student's doubt by sitting them down for an open-ended philosophical debate.
Rarely. They view Western philosophy, modern rationalism, and endless debate with extreme suspicion, seeing them as slippery slopes to atheism. The cure for doubt, in their view, is not to engage in secular logic, because human reason is inherently flawed, subjective, and easily manipulated. Revelation is the only objective truth.
So what is the cure?
Therefore, the cure for doubt is to increase one's obedience, to study the classical texts even more rigorously under a qualified master, and to relentlessly purify the heart through tazkiyah and prayer until the spiritual disease is eradicated.
It's actually pretty simple from their perspective, isn't it? That the truth doesn't need to adapt to the century. The century needs to align with the truth. They argue that abandoning their traditional framework for Western secularism doesn't lead to true freedom. It leads to societal moral collapse, extreme individual anxiety, and the ultimate tragedy, the loss of the eternal soul.
Yes.
They view their strictness, their fatwas, and their uncompromising rules not as a cage meant to trap people, but as a necessary fortress protecting the believer from a chaotic, spiritually toxic world.
And that brings us perfectly full circle to your analysis of the seed vault. They built the fortress in 1866 to keep the British colonizers out, and they maintain the massive walls of that exact same fortress today to keep secular modernity out.
Which leads us to our final assessment of this massive historical journey. We have traversed from the bloody, traumatic aftermath of the 1857 rebellion through the intricate medieval logic of the Darzi-Nizami curriculum. We've tracked the millions of Tablighi Jamaat missionaries walking the globe door to door.
We've waded through the tragic geopolitical militarization in Afghanistan during the Cold War.
And we've confronted the rigid, uncompromising fatwas violently clashing with the realities of 21st century life.
And when you synthesize all of this data, all these historical movements, the Deobandi movement emerges as the ultimate orthodox stoic of the Islamic world. It is a movement that succeeded brilliantly, perhaps far beyond its founders' wildest imaginations, sitting under that pomegranate tree at its original core mission, preserving traditional Orthodox Islamic identity and deep classical scholarship from colonial and modern erasure.
Without Darul Uloom Deoband, the landscape of South Asian Islam would be unimaginably different, perhaps unrecognizable today.
Yet the very tools that ensured its survival, the intense insularity, the profound rejection of the natural sciences, the unwavering, almost rigid commitment to classical jurisprudence, and the deep suspicion of outside influence leave it in a constant grinding state of friction with the modern world. It offers its millions of followers a profound sense of clarity, an anchor, and rigorous spiritual discipline. But it demands an almost absolute, compartmentalization from the shifting tides of global culture, scientific paradigm shifts, and the evolving roles of individuals in society.
It is a living, breathing paradox. It is a radically decentralized network capable of monumental, peaceful, global mobilization, yet it often finds itself institutionally paralyzed or fiercely defensive when faced with the complex philosophical and social demands of rapidly accelerating modernity. And that leaves us, and you listening, with a final provocative thought to mull over as we close this exploration. We live in a hyper-connected digital age of artificial intelligence, rapid social upheaval, and an inescapable globalized culture. The weather outside the vault is changing faster than ever before in recorded human history. In a storm like this, is the ultimate form of rebellion simply building a higher, thicker wall around your ancient traditions to weather the storm? Or does the true preservation of a seed require taking it out of the freezing vault, opening the gates, planting it in new, unpredictable soil, and trusting it to survive the elements?
That's the question they have to answer.
Renella, grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.